Everyone in the village saw him. Everyone spoke to him. And when he died, no one was guilty. The road ended without warning, not with a sign, not with a gate, just a gradual loss of intention. Edward Hale noticed it immediately. The asphalt thinned, the markings disappeared, and the hedges on either side grew taller, closer, as if they were no longer decorative but corrective, guiding him, narrowing his options. His phone lost signal 3 minutes earlier. Not abruptly, politely. 1 bar. Then none. Edward glanced at the dashboard clock. 4:37 p.m. Still daylight. That mattered. Black Hollow Parish did not announce itself. There was no welcome sign. No warning. No historical plaque explaining why the place deserved to exist. Just a cluster of stone houses folded into the land, as if they had grown there instead of being built. Smoke rose from several chimneys. Edward slowed the car. People noticed him immediately. Not openly. Windows shifted. Movement paused. A man standing near a fence stopped hammering and watched the car pass without changing his expression. Edward felt the familiar sensation settle in his chest. Not danger. Assessment. He'd parked near the church because that was where the space allowed it. The church stood at the center of the parish, older than the road, older than most ideas Edward trusted. Its bell tower was squat, practical, not dramatic. The kind of church that had learned long ago not to draw attention to itself. Edward stepped out of the car. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. No traffic. No distant hum. The silence wasn't empty. It was occupied. The constable was waiting for him near the low stone wall that bordered the churchyard. Local. Young. Trying very hard to look like this was routine. "Mr. Hale," the constable said. "Thanks for coming all this way." Edward shook his hand. "You look relieved," Edward said. The constable smiled thinly. "I am," he admitted. "We don't get many situations like this." Edward glanced toward the village. "You get them," he said. "You just don't name them." The constable didn't argue. They walked together toward the edge of the parish, where the land dipped sharply. The path was worn, not officially maintained. Used. Edward noticed that too. "Who found him?" Edward asked. The constable hesitated. "A few people," he said. "Different times." Edward looked at him. "That's not an answer," he said. The constable exhaled. "Everyone," he said quietly. The body lay in the shallow ravine, like something the land had decided to return. A man in his late 30s. Well-dressed, even now. No obvious signs of a struggle. His jacket was folded neatly beside him. Shoes placed parallel. Wallet still in his pocket. Edward crouched. The face was bruised. Not badly. Precisely. Blows that had been measured. Edward straightened. "Cause of death?" he asked. "Blunt force trauma," the constable said. "Multiple impacts." Edward nodded. "And yet, he didn't fight," Edward said. The constable swallowed. "No," he said. "Doesn't look like it." Edward looked around. The ravine was narrow. Too narrow for chaos. "This wasn't an attack," Edward said quietly. "This was a procedure." The constable flinched. They stood there longer than necessary. Not because there was more to see. Because Edward needed to feel how the place behaved around a death. The land didn't recoil. The parish didn't rush. It absorbed. Edward straightened and brushed dirt from his hands. "Who was he?" Edward asked. The constable checked his notebook. "Thomas Reed," he said. "Estate agent. From London." Edward nodded. "And why was he here?" Edward asked. The constable looked back toward the village. "He was asking questions," he said. Edward waited. About land? The constable added. Development. Investment. Edward nodded again. Change, he said. The constable didn't smile. As they walked back toward the church, people emerged. Not to watch. To pass by. Each of them acknowledged Edward politely. A nod. A greeting. An offer of help. Terrible business, an elderly woman said softly. So shocking. Edward thanked her. She smiled kindly and walked on. Edward turned to the constable. She's lying, Edward said calmly. The constable's eyes widened. How can you tell? He asked. Edward watched the woman disappear between houses. She's shocked by inconvenience, Edward said. Not by violence. Inside the church, it smelled of wax and old stone. Someone had already put the kettle on. Edward noticed the cups laid out. More than necessary. Prepared? This way, the constable said, leading him to a small room near the vestry. Edward paused. Who prepared this? Edward asked. The constable hesitated. The parish council, he said. Edward nodded. Of course they did, he replied. The first interview was with Margaret Elwood, unofficial caretaker of the parish. No title. No badge. Just consensus. She sat opposite Edward with her hands folded. Calm. Well spoken. I saw him in the morning, she said. He asked about the old fields. Edward nodded. What did you tell him? Edward asked. Margaret smiled gently. That it wasn't for sale, she said. Edward leaned back. And when did you last see him alive? Edward asked. Margaret didn't hesitate. That was the last time, she said. Edward wrote it down. The second interview was with Peter Lawson, builder. Strong hands. Soft voice. I walked with him for a bit, Peter said. Showed him the footpath. Edward looked up. Which footpath? He asked. Peter pointed vaguely. The one by the trees, he said. Edward nodded. And then? Edward asked. Peter shrugged. He went on. He said. I turned back. Edward wrote. The third interview was with Alice Morton, schoolteacher. Polite. Measured. He stopped by the school, she said. Asked about enrollment numbers. Edward looked at her. And? He asked. I told him the truth, she said. That we like things as they are. Edward nodded. And after that? Edward asked. Alice smiled faintly. I didn't see him again, she said. By the fourth interview, Edward stopped writing. Not because he had enough information, because he had too much of the same. Every resident had seen Thomas Reed. Every resident had spoken to him. Every resident had been the last. Edward closed his notebook. Do you know what that means? He asked the constable quietly. The constable swallowed. It means we're thorough, he said weakly. Edward looked at him. It means you're describing a relay, Edward said. Not a coincidence. As evening fell, the bell rang. Once. Not loud. But everyone heard it. Conversation stopped. Doors opened. People moved toward the church without being told. Edward watched from the doorway. What's happening? He asked. The constable hesitated. Community supper, he said. It's customary. Edward nodded. And attendance? Edward asked. The constable lowered his voice. Expected, he said. Edward stepped aside as people entered. No one refused. Inside, tables were set. Food was shared. Conversation resumed. But Thomas Reed was never mentioned. Edward sat among them, unnoticed and yet completely visible. He realized something with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold stone walls. This was not a village that reacted to crime. This was a village that processed disruption. Edward looked around. At the faces. At the hands. At the ease with which everyone participated. And he understood the true nature of the case. This wasn't about finding a killer. It was about understanding an agreement. Later that night, Edward stood outside the church. The parish lay quiet again. Too quiet. The bell tower loomed above him. Edward wrote one sentence in his notebook. In places like this, violence doesn't erupt. It's distributed. He closed the notebook. Behind him, somewhere in the dark, a door closed softly. Not locked. Just closed. Edward Hale slept in the guest room above the parish hall. They didn't call it a hotel. They didn't call it accommodation. They called it available. That word bothered him more than it should have. The room was clean in the way only places without visitors could be. No personal objects. No dust. No signs of anyone passing through recently. The bedspread was folded with care, not hospitality. The window overlooked the churchyard. Gravestones lay in neat rows, none newer than 5 years. Edward noticed that too. He lay awake longer than he meant to, listening. Not for footsteps. For coordination. The parish had gone quiet quickly, as if someone had turned down a volume knob. At 10:42 p.m., the bell rang once. Not loudly. Edward sat up in bed. The sound wasn't a call. It was confirmation. Morning came without drama. No birds. No distant engines. Just light, filtered through fog that clung to the ground like it had nowhere else to be. Edward showered, dressed, and went downstairs. The hall smelled of bread and something herbal. Breakfast had been prepared. Not laid out. Prepared. A man he hadn't met yet stood by the table. "Morning," the man said warmly. "You must be Mr. Hale." Edward nodded. "Edward," he replied. "Jonah," the man said, extending his hand. "I handle maintenance." Edward shook it. Jonah's grip was firm, practiced, not curious. "Did you sleep well?" Jonah asked. "Well enough," Edward said. Jonah smiled. "Good," he said. "We like our guests rested." Edward noted the plural. As Edward ate, people drifted in and out of the hall. No one lingered. Each greeted him. Each asked if he needed anything. Each suggested someone else who might be better suited to help. "If it's about the land, talk to Peter. If it's about history, Margaret knows. If it's about the children, Alice can explain." Edward smiled, nodded, thanked them. Inside, he mapped the pattern. No one claimed authority. Everyone redirected responsibility. Edward walked the village late morning. Not to investigate. To be seen. He passed the school, small, well-kept, windows spotless. Children played quietly. Too quietly. A girl looked up and waved at him. Edward waved back. Her smile flickered, then she turned and ran back toward the building. Edward felt a faint chill. Children noticed things adults rehearsed ignoring. At the edge of the village, he found the footpath. The one Peter had mentioned. It led toward the ravine. Edward walked it slowly. The grass was flattened in places. Not trampled. Pressed. As if many feet had passed, but not in a hurry. Edward stopped halfway and looked around. The path curved just enough to obscure the village. From here, you could hear nothing of it. No bells. No voices. Just wind through trees. Edward imagined Thomas Reed here. Walking. Talking. Still believing this was a negotiation. A voice behind him made him turn. "You'll slip if you're not careful." Peter Lawson stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. Edward nodded. "Noted," he said. Peter smiled. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Peter said. Edward looked at the ravine. "Practical," he replied. Peter's smile paused, then returned. They walked back together. not side by side. Close enough to suggest company, far enough to preserve space. You don't get many visitors, Edward said. Peter shrugged. We don't advertise, he said. Edward nodded. And yet, you are all very ready for one, Edward said. Peter chuckled softly. We like to be prepared, he said. Edward let that sit. At noon, Edward met Margaret Elwood again, this time in her kitchen. The kettle was already boiling when he arrived. You take milk? She asked. Edward nodded. Margaret poured without measuring. People misunderstand places like ours, she said conversationally. They think we're hiding something. Edward accepted the cup. And are you? He asked. Margaret smiled gently. We're protecting something, she said. Edward sipped. And what's the difference? He asked. Margaret met his gaze. Intent, she said. Edward asked about Thomas Reed. Margaret sighed. He was persistent, she said. Not rude. Just convinced. Edward nodded. Of what? He asked. That everything should grow, she replied. That stagnation is failure. Edward leaned back. And you disagree, he said. Margaret shook her head. We believe survival is success, she said. Edward wrote it down. In the afternoon, Edward spoke with Alice Morton, the schoolteacher. She corrected papers while they talked. Efficient. He didn't understand why we wouldn't sell, she said. Edward watched her pen move. Did you explain? He asked. Alice nodded. I told him we'd seen developments before, she said. They arrive smiling and leave foundations. Edward looked up. And then? He asked. Alice paused. He said progress always hurts at first, she said quietly. Edward nodded. And you didn't agree, he said. Alice met his gaze. No, she replied. We agreed it hurts. Edward wrote nothing. By late afternoon, Edward had spoken to nearly everyone. And yet, nothing had advanced. No contradictions. No defensiveness. No slips. Just a seamless narrative of politeness. Edward returned to the churchyard and sat on a low wall. He took out his notebook and reviewed the names. Every single one connected to Thomas Reed's last day. Every single one necessary. Edward felt the first true weight of the case settle in. This wasn't a murder mystery. It was a systems analysis. The bell rang again at dusk. Twice this time. Edward stood. He followed the sound toward the church. Inside, people gathered quietly. No ceremony. No prayer. Just presence. Margaret stood near the front. We'll speak later, she said softly when she saw Edward. Edward nodded. He noticed something then. An empty space. A chair left unoccupied. He leaned toward the constable. Who's missing? Edward asked. The constable hesitated. No one, he said. Edward looked at the chair. Someone always is, Edward replied. Dinner was served. Conversation flowed. Weather, repairs, crops, never Thomas. Edward realized something else. They weren't avoiding the topic. They'd finished with it. Later, as people dispersed, an old man approached Edward. Thin, stooped, eyes sharp. You won't find what you're looking for, the man said calmly. Edward looked at him. Why not? He asked. The man smiled. Because you're asking the wrong question, he said. Edward waited. You're asking who did it, the man continued. You should be asking why we agreed. Edward's breath slowed. And why did you? Edward asked. The old man looked toward the darkened village. Because we're still here, he said. Then he walked away. That night, Edward returned to his room. The bell did not ring again. He stood at the window, looking down at the graves. Names. Dates. Long gaps. Edward wrote again. No one here thinks of themselves as violent. That's what makes it possible. He closed the notebook. Outside, the village slept. Not innocently. Efficiently. Edward Hale woke before dawn. Not because he was rested, and not because he heard something. Simply because in Black Hollow Parish, morning did not arrive. It switched on. At some point, night simply ceased to be permitted. He looked at his watch again. 5:58 a.m. In 2 minutes, he was certain something would happen. And indeed, exactly at 6, a sound spread through the village. Not a bell. Not footsteps. A creak, as if several doors opened at once. Edward sat up on the bed and listened. A minute later, smells. Smoke. Bread. Hot water. The village began to function. He went outside without waiting for an invitation. There were already people in the street. Not all of them, but enough that it did not feel accidental. No one seemed surprised to see him. That was worse than surprise. "Morning," several voices said at once. "Morning," Edward replied. They accepted him as part of the schedule. Near the school, he saw Alice Morton again. She was unlocking the door. "You're up early," she said. "I didn't want to miss anything," Edward replied. Alice smiled. "Nothing ever happens here early," she said. Edward glanced at his watch. 6:12 a.m. "You'd be surprised," he said. Alice did not argue. Edward decided to do the thing that usually breaks consensus. He began to circle back. To everyone. Again. But this time with specifics. The first was Peter Lawson. He was working by the shed, sorting planks. "You said you showed him the path," Edward said without preamble. "Which one exactly?" Peter did not look up. "The safe one," he said. Edward leaned closer. "Safe for whom?" he asked. Peter straightened. "For us," he said calmly. Edward wrote it down. Margaret Elwood met him by the fence. "You've already asked me these things," she said gently. "I didn't ask this thing," Edward replied. "Who decided he couldn't stay?" Margaret studied him closely. "No one decides things alone here," she said. "That's not an answer," Edward said. "It's the only honest one," she replied. Edward felt it again. Not resistance. Correction. Every conversation gently guided him back into the acceptable field. By noon, Edward noticed he was being followed. Not directly. Someone always ended up nearby. Not the same person. Always a different one. If he stopped, someone else stopped. If he turned, someone turned elsewhere. Not a shadow. A contour. He returned to the ravine. This time not alone. Jonah, the same maintenance man, was there as well. "You walk a lot," Jonah remarked. "I think better when I move," Edward said. "We find that useful too," Jonah replied. Edward looked at him. "For what?" he asked. Jonah shrugged. "For noticing patterns," he said. Edward nodded. "Then you've noticed one," he said. Jonah smiled. "You're trying to isolate a moment," he said. "There isn't one." Edward exhaled slowly. "There's always a moment," he said. "Even in accidents." Jonah looked toward the ravine. "This wasn't an accident," he said. And for the first time, no one contradicted him. That evening, Edward finally found a crack. Her name was Emily Carter. Young. Not local by origin. Moved here 3 years ago. She would not meet his eyes. "I didn't touch him," she said immediately. Edward sat across from her. "I didn't ask if you did," he said. Emily swallowed. "I only watched," she said. Edward froze. "Watched what?" he asked. Emily closed her eyes. When they took him down the path, she said. I was by the fence. Edward waited. He wasn't shouting, she continued. He kept saying, let's just talk. Edward felt something tighten inside the listener he had become. Who was with him? He asked. Emily shook her head. Everyone, she said, but never all at once. Now she spoke quickly. Too quickly. Someone always stepped in when it got quiet, she said. Someone else when it got tense. Edward did not interrupt. I thought someone would stop it, she said. But stopping it would have meant standing alone. She looked at him for the first time. And no one stands alone here, she said. That evening, the bell did not ring. Edward understood that this, too, was a signal. His presence had disrupted the rhythm, and the village had marked it. That night, he heard footsteps beneath his window. Not furtive. Ordinary. Checking. Edward did not approach the window. He did not want to confirm himself. He wrote in his notebook for a long time. Not names. Structure. Identify threat. Diffuse responsibility. Normalize participation. Remove singular guilt. Resume routine. He closed the notebook and understood the central truth. If he named a single killer, the village would survive. If he named the mechanism, the village would die. Just before dawn, someone knocked. Softly, Edward opened the door. Margaret stood on the threshold. You're asking dangerous questions, she said. Only of dangerous systems, Edward replied. Margaret studied him for a long moment. You won't save him, she said. I'm not trying to, Edward replied. I'm trying to understand you. Margaret nodded. Then understand this, she said. We didn't choose violence. We chose continuity. She left. Edward remained standing in the doorway, and for the first time, he understood. This village does not fear the law. It fears change, and for that fear it is willing to be perfect. Edward Hale knew the meeting would happen before anyone told him. That was the thing about Black Hollow Parish. Nothing was announced. Nothing was demanded. Things were simply understood. The bell rang at noon. 3 times. Not loud. Not urgent. Definitive. Edward was already on his feet when the last vibration faded into the air. He didn't bring his notebook. He didn't need it anymore. The church filled slowly. Not ceremonially. Practically. People took their usual places without looking for guidance. Couples sat apart. Families didn't cluster. No one stood near the aisles. Edward noticed how space itself was managed. The empty chair from the previous night was gone. That mattered. Margaret Elwood stood near the front, not elevated, not central. Just visible enough. Her presence functioned like punctuation. Edward took a seat near the middle. No one avoided him. No one welcomed him. He was included. That was worse. Margaret spoke without raising her voice. We understand there are questions, she said. No mention of death. No mention of Thomas Reed. Edward listened to the phrasing. Questions, not accusations. Margaret continued. This parish has survived because we address problems before they grow, she said. Edward felt the subtle tightening in his chest again. The same sensation as in the safe room months ago. Containment without walls. Edward stood. The sound of movement rippled through the church, then settled. I'm not here to accuse anyone, Edward said calmly. That was true. He paused. I'm here to understand a sequence of actions, he continued. No one objected. He looked around. Thomas Reed arrived here with an intention, Edward said. He wanted to change this place. A murmur passed through the room. Not disagreement. Recognition. Edward continued. He spoke to Margaret about land. He nodded toward her. She inclined her head slightly. He walked with Peter along the path. Peter didn't move. He asked Alice about the school. Alice folded her hands. He was seen by Jonah near the ravine. Jonah's jaw tightened. Edward's voice remained steady. And by Emily at the fence. Emily's breath caught. Edward let the silence stretch. No one here planned to kill Thomas Reed, Edward said. Several people nodded. Relief flickered across faces. Edward raised a hand slightly. But many of you planned for him not to succeed, he said. The nod slowed. Edward continued. Margaret told him the land wasn't for sale. That was reasonable. Margaret nodded once. Peter showed him the path. That was helpful. Peter shifted his weight. Alice explained why the school wouldn't expand. That was honest. Alice stared at the floor. Edward's voice dropped slightly. Someone suggested he walk farther. That was convenient. A breath moved through the room. Someone tied his hands. That was preventative. The air thickened. Someone struck him. That was corrective. Emily closed her eyes. Edward did not raise his voice. And someone else stood nearby, he said, making sure no one stood alone. A man in the back spoke. We didn't decide anything, he said. Edward looked at him. No, Edward replied. You agreed. The word landed harder than an accusation. Agreement required participation. Margaret spoke again gently. You're describing cooperation, she said. Not violence. Edward turned to her. Violence doesn't require anger, Edward said. It requires alignment. Margaret's smile faded. We protected our home, she said. Edward nodded. You protected continuity, he replied. And continuity required removal. Peter stood abruptly. He wasn't listening, Peter snapped. He kept pushing. Edward met his gaze. And so did you, Edward said quietly. Peter froze. Edward continued. You pushed him down the path, Edward said. Not with force. With inevitability. Peter's hands trembled. I didn't hit him, Peter said. Edward nodded. No, he replied. You made sure he was where someone else could. Alice looked up. He was scaring the children, she said. Edward looked at her. No, Edward replied. He was promising futures. Alice flinched. Edward continued. Futures require disruption, he said. This parish doesn't tolerate disruption. Emily's voice broke. I thought someone would stop it, she whispered. Edward turned to her. And why didn't you? He asked. Emily swallowed. Because stopping it meant being the only one, she said. Edward nodded. And being the only one here, he said, is the most dangerous position. Margaret didn't deny it. Edward took a breath. This is how the system works, he said. You distribute responsibility until no single action is fatal. Then you tell yourselves no one killed him. He looked around the room. And technically you're right, he said. Silence pressed down. The constable shifted near the door. You're saying they all, he began. Edward interrupted him. No, Edward said. I'm saying none of them did. The constable stared. Edward turned back to the parish. You didn't kill Thomas Reed, Edward said. You made it impossible for him to remain. He paused. And when he couldn't remain, Edward continued, the land finished what you started. Margaret spoke softly. We didn't want to hurt him, she said. Edward met her gaze. I believe you, he said. That's why this worked. Edward took one step forward. I could name someone, he said. Charge them. The room tensed. But that would preserve the mechanism, he continued. It would let you tell yourselves it was a deviation. Margaret's eyes narrowed. And what will you do? She asked. Edward exhaled slowly. I will describe this parish exactly as it functions, he said, to people who believe systems can be corrected. A pause. And if they don't? Margaret asked. Edward's voice was flat. Then they'll call this an unfortunate incident, he said, and nothing will change. Margaret nodded. That's acceptable, she said. Edward looked at her. That's terrifying, he replied. The meeting ended without dismissal. People stood. Chairs scraped softly. No one rushed. Edward remained seated until the church was empty. The constable approached him. You're not arresting anyone, the constable said. Edward shook his head. No, he replied. Then what was the point? The constable asked. Edward looked toward the door. To make it visible, he said, even if nothing happens next. Outside, the village resumed. Doors opened. Children laughed. Life returned to schedule. Edward stood at the edge of the parish road. Margaret joined him. You won't be welcome back, she said calmly. Edward nodded. I wouldn't be, he replied. She watched him for a moment. We didn't enjoy it, she said. Edward met her gaze. That's what makes it sustainable, he replied. As Edward drove away, the road widened again. Signal returned. Noise crept back into the world. But something stayed with him. Not anger. Understanding. He stopped once and wrote in his notebook. Closed communities don't need secrets. They need agreement. Then, beneath it, an agreement is the quietest weapon we have. Edward closed the notebook. Behind him, Black Hollow Parish continued. Unchanged. Efficient. Alive. Black Hollow Parish did not make the news. Not properly. There was a brief mention in a regional report, a body found, an investigation conducted, no charges filed due to insufficient evidence of individual culpability. The phrasing was careful. It always was. Edward Hale read the article once, then folded the paper and left it on the table of a quiet cafe 2 counties away. Someone else could carry it home. The official report was longer, thicker, filled with language designed to contain meaning. Edward had contributed to it reluctantly, not because he doubted his conclusions, because he knew how they would be received. Collective responsibility, the report said, was difficult to prosecute. Cultural isolation was not a crime. Community cohesion could not be legally defined as intent. Edward underlined one sentence with a pen that barely wrote. No single action could be identified as the direct cause of death. He added a note in the margin. That was the point. The constable transferred out 2 weeks later. No scandal. No reprimand. Just a request for reassignment that was quietly approved. Edward received a short message from him. I keep thinking about what you said. About agreement. Edward didn't reply. There was nothing useful to add. Some thoughts had to echo on their own. Margaret Elwood continued her role in the parish. No title. No promotion. Just continuity. Edward learned this from a follow-up inquiry conducted by an external review board. They interviewed residents again. Everyone's account was consistent. Time had not eroded memory. It had polished it. Thomas Reed was now referred to as a misunderstanding. Language had already done its work. Emily Carter left. That surprised Edward less than it should have. She moved to a town 3 hours south, took a job below her qualifications, and avoided close-knit communities thereafter. She wrote Edward one letter. Not long. Not emotional. Just one line that stayed with him. Being alone is frightening. But it's quieter than agreeing to things you can't undo. Edward folded the letter carefully and placed it in his notebook. 6 months later, Edward received an invitation. Not from Black Hollow Parish. From a planning commission. They wanted his opinion on a proposed development near a rural community with strong cultural cohesion. Edward declined. He didn't trust himself not to sound tired. On a cold evening in early winter, Edward found himself driving past a village that looked unsettlingly familiar. Stone houses, narrow roads, a single church at the center. He slowed, then kept driving. Understanding didn't obligate repetition. Edward spent more time alone after Black Hollow. Not isolated, selective. He avoided rooms where agreement felt too easy. He listened longer before speaking. And when someone said everyone thinks this way, Edward felt his body tense in quiet recognition. One night, as rain tapped steadily against the window, Edward opened his notebook again. He reread the entries from the parish. He didn't revise them. He added only one final passage. Folk horror doesn't come from beliefs. It comes from maintenance. From people who believe survival requires sameness. And from systems where dissent feels like betrayal. The most frightening communities are not violent. They are stable. Edward closed the notebook. Far away, Black Hollow Parish prepared for winter. Wood was stacked. Roofs were checked. Children learned the same lessons they always had. Nothing else needed to be said. The parish would survive. It always had. Edward turned off the light and sat in the dark for a while longer than usual. He thought of Thomas Reed, not as a victim, as a variable. Someone who introduced uncertainty into a place that could not tolerate it. Edward exhaled slowly. Then he stood, put on his coat, and stepped back into the noise of the world. Noise meant disagreement. Disagreement meant friction. And friction, however uncomfortable, was PR.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more psychological mysteries where nothing supernatural is happening, and that's what makes it disturbing. New detective stories are released regularly. Until next time, pay attention to the words people choose.